These are the 6.6 notes for trig. We're going to be talking about this unit, graphs of sine and cosine. So 3 words that we're going to need to learn today: midline, amplitude, and period. Before we get to that, we're actually going to graph sine and cosine. The way we're going to do that is we're going to use our unit circle to fill out these 5 values for sine and cosine. So we're going to first start with the sine of 0. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my unit circle. I'm going to find 0 degrees here, and the sine is the y value. So I'm going to write down 0. Sine of 0 is 0. Then the next one, sine of pi over 2. Go back to my unit circle. Here's pi over 2. Here's the sine value, the y, which is 1. Next one, sine of pi. Here's pi over here. And we can see that the y value is again 0. Do that for the next one and the next one. Take a second, see if you can use your unit circle to do the rest. Sine of 3 pi over 2 should be -1. And sine of 2 pi, which is the same place as our original 0, so that's still going to be 0. And now we're going to take those and we're going to plot them on our little grid. You can see your y-axis is your 0, 1, and -1. And then your x-axis are your radians, your pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. So we'll start by plotting the point 0, 0. All right, that one's taken care of. Now the next point is going to be pi over 2, 1, which means you'll go over to pi over 2 and then up to 1. At pi, you're going to have a point on 0. 3 pi over 2, you'll have a point at -1. And at 2 pi, you'll have a point at 0. And then I connect these, and all the sine and cosine graphs make a wave shape. So you can see as you look a little further down the notes, all the waves that these are going to be making. Now we'll do the same thing for cosine. I'll give you a minute here. Go ahead and fill in, using your unit circle, fill in all your values for cosine. So this time all you're doing is looking for the x instead of the y. Okay, so we should have been able to fill in 1, 0, -1, 0, and 1. As we graph these, 1, 0, -1, 0, and 1. Now, when we connect these dots, we want to make sure that we make this a wave. So not a V shape, but a wave. So think about it as going from the top of the wave right here, all the way down, and then back to the top of the wave. Sometimes I extend it just a little bit further so I can kind of see that that's the top of the wave. So one is a cosine graph and one is a sine graph. Although as you look at them, they look very similar if you keep graphing them. Like this one down here, example 1. Let's take a look at example 1, and we'll talk about midline, amplitude, and period. The midline is exactly what it sounds like. It is the middle line, almost like the baseline where the graph is. So on the 2 that we did up here, sine and cosine, our midline would be 0, right through here. Right? It's the same distance above and below. It's right where those middle dots are. So as we look at example 1, it looks like our midline is right here through -1. So when I write that, I'm going to write y equals -1. So it actually is written as a line. All right, the amplitude is the height of the graph. So it's from the midline to the top, which will also be the same distance as the midline to the bottom. So from the green midline here, how far is it up to the top of one of these waves? If I look at this very first wave over here, it looks like I go up 1, 2, and 3 to get to the top. And from the midline, I also go down 1, 2, 3 to get to the bottom of the wave. That means my amplitude is 3. So again, amplitude would be how tall it is here from the midline. Amplitude, 3. The period is how long the graph is before it repeats itself. So we call it the length until it repeats. So if we look at this graph, I always start from the y-axis. So from right here, my first dot goes here, and then I can see that the wave goes up, comes back to the middle, goes down, comes back to the middle, and then it starts over. It goes up and then down, and then up and then down. So this right here is called one period. So notice where that stops, pi over 3. So the period will be pi over 3. And then I have to decide whether this is a sine graph or a cosine graph. The difference is where your graph starts and what it looks like once you have one full period here. So that to me looks like a sine graph. The sine graphs, remember, look a little bit more like a wave, whereas the cosine graphs look more like almost a U shape if you just look at one period of it. So the sine graphs are always going to start on the midline, and the cosine graphs are going to start at the top above the midline. So this would be a sine graph. All right, let's look at example 2. For example 2, first identify the midline. See if you can find where the baseline, middle line of that graph is. Should be right here, again at -1. So for the midline, we'll write it as a line, y equals -1. The amplitude, how tall the graph is from the midline. So from the midline, count up to the top of the wave. So I'm going to count up to here, and I notice it's 1, 2, 3, 4. So from the midline up, same thing from the midline down to the bottom of a wave. Those numbers will always be the same. Amplitude is 4. For the period, I have to start on the y-axis. So I'll start right here. And my first dot, it looks like it's on the midline. And then I'm going up and down and down and back to the middle. And then it starts over. So top of the wave, bottom of the wave. And then the next thing looks like it'll be top of the wave, bottom of the wave. So that's one full graph, one full period. And it looks like it ends at 2 pi. And then as you draw those 5 dots out to see the top of the wave and the bottom of the wave, you'll notice that it looks like a sine graph. Again, sine graphs start on the midline, then go up, back to the midline, down, and finish back at the midline before they repeat themselves. Let's move on to example number 3. Midline right here would be at 3. So y equals 3. And you can draw that dashed line if you want, but you don't have to. Amplitude, how tall that wave is. Above the midline, below the midline, that would be just an amplitude of 1. The highest it goes is 4, the lowest it goes is 2, and your midline is 3. All right, the period, remember we have to start at the beginning at the y-axis. So here, and then it goes top of the wave, down to the bottom of the wave, back to the top of the wave again before it starts repeating. So notice where it stops. Notice where it would start repeating itself, 2 pi, that's the period. And then sine or cosine. Remember, cosine graphs start up at the top of the wave above the midline. So this would be a cosine graph. Number 4. Our midline here. Take a look at it, see if you can find the midline. Midline is happening at y equals -3. Amplitude, how tall the wave is. So from the midline to the top of the wave, that's 2. The period, how long until this graph starts repeating itself. So let's start from the beginning, our y-axis. There's a point right here. And then let's follow that. It goes top of the wave, bottom of the wave, and then back again to top of the wave. We've already done that. So you have these 5 points that are going to make up your graph before it starts to repeat itself. Notice where it stops at pi. That's the period. Again, period is how long before the graph starts to just repeat itself in that continuous pattern. And then we need to identify whether this is sine or cosine. This is going to be a sine graph because it starts in the middle. It starts on the baseline right here. Sine graphs always go up and then down and then back to the middle. All right, example number 5. See what you can do with this one. Take a little bit of time, see if you can identify the midline, amplitude, period, and sine, cosine. Midline should be 2. Amplitude, how tall the wave is, also 2. So notice the midline is at 2, and then it goes up 2 to get the 4, and down 2 to reach that 0 line. All right, so it goes from 0 to 4, 2 being the midline. All right, the period, how long this graph is before it repeats. I always have to start on the y-axis. This time the graph, again, notice, doesn't start on the baseline. It doesn't start on the midline. It starts above it. So here, then it comes down to the middle, bottom, middle, back to the top before it goes down again. That's when it starts to repeat. So notice it's always 5 dots that make up that period length before it starts to repeat again. And notice where it stops. It stops at 3 pi and then starts repeating itself. So the period is 3 pi. And we just have to identify whether this is a sine or cosine graph. Notice the shape of it, going from the top of the wave to the top of the wave. That would be a cosine graph. Cosine graphs start at the top. Sine graphs start on the midline.